You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hey everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward, for the benefit of Jake's grandson and my son, Ben the Bear. But we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting these up on YouTube for free. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. I'm looking forward to talking about the Arsenal of Freedom.
So am I. This is actually a really great episode, and I think it's a good discussion not only about the time this episode debuted, but the times we're living in now. So for those at home, this is Star Trek: The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 20 on Netflix, but it's 21 in the official count on Memory Alpha. This episode debuted on April 11th, 1988. And before we get started, how do you feel about this episode, Jake, in terms of where it is in the season, in terms of its storytelling? We're later in the first season, so we're getting close to the end.
Um, it's a story of a little bit of a different twist.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one interesting thing, it really develops Geordi's character a lot more. When you mention, this episode being in 1988, the Cold War, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was still very warm, and there's a lot of, issues related to, armaments and arms and so forth, and how they maintain peace and the threats and so forth, and some futuristic things that come up in this episode.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing that this episode brings up, and it's kind of concurrent in a lot of sci-fi, especially what I kind of term for myself interstellar sci-fi, or the stuff where they have faster than light travel and they have things like weapons that they use in intergalactic combat. Um, I think that this is a really good episode in terms of hammering home the theme of just because the weapon is there doesn't mean it's actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I also agree with you that like this is a great Geordi episode, and it's a very good episode for LeVar Burton, and surprisingly, a cast that we don't really see a lot. There's a lot of interesting things going on here, but to get people started, the crew of the Enterprise is going to a planet called Minos in the Loren system after a uh, the USS Drake, a Federation ship in that sector, has gone missing, which was captained by a friend of Will Riker's named Paul Rice. Immediately when they arrive, a message engages the Enterprise communication systems that turns out to be kind of an answering machine for an arms dealer on Minos. And
It's a robocall.
Yeah, it's a robocall, which is very interesting because kind of getting into this, robocalls are such a prevalent thing now in 2021, and they have been for the last couple of years. In 1988, were you and Mom having to deal with things like robocalls, or were these just not?
No.
Okay.
We were just starting to. You were just starting to. Very wealthy people were just getting portable phones that were the size of bricks.
What about answering machines? Did you have answering machines?
I think there were answering machines back then. Yes.
Okay.
But even if people had answering machines, you know, companies weren't trying to sell you things. They weren't leaving messages on answering machine. Well, call me back if you want to buy a new car, you know, and that kind of stuff. No.
Um, so, I think the interesting thing, let me see, I wanted to find the. So, the Monosian peddler who arrives in the communique basically says that, if you come down here, we will be able to show you these magnificent arms that are the talk of the galaxy. And they send down Yar, Data, and Riker, I believe, as the first crew, as the first wave team. And down there, they engage with a person that appears to be Captain Paul Rice from the USS Drake, but they are quickly convinced during an interaction with Riker that Paul Rice is not actually the person he appears when he refuses to answer kind of typical human questions. He doesn't pass what I think is interpreted as the Turing test.
Mhm.
And from there, we are introduced to kind of the main threat of the show, which is this floating, weapon device. I don't. Did they ever give it a name besides the drone?
I don't recall. I mean, this whole weapon system that
The Echo Papa 607.
yeah, okay, that's what they did. But the salesman, when he talks about this system, it's very comprehensive because it not only provides weapons, offensive weapons capability, but it also had intelligence gathering capability built
Mm-hmm.
in, which is what the projection of Paul Rice was, that he, showed up and talked to Riker and tried to get information about what's the name of your ship, what's its armaments, and so forth. And um, Riker starts asking, or actually, the Enterprise, calls down to Riker and said, "Look, there's really no life form there. There's some energy there, but that's not a human being you're talking to." So with that sort of intelligence from the Enterprise, uh, Riker knows, starts to get a sense of what he's dealing with. But
Actually,
that gets an. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, I have some quotes actually from Riker's interaction with Rice's hologram. So if you mind, I'm going to read some of them just because I think
Go
they're
ahead.
kind of they're enlightening to what we're talking about. So tell me about your ship, Riker. It's the Enterprise, isn't it? No, my ship's name is the Lollipop. I have no knowledge of that ship. It's just been commissioned. It's a good ship. What's the armament of your ship? 10. 10? I don't understand. 10 what? 6. Commander Riker, your answers make no sense. You haven't used my first name once, Paul. You remember it, don't you? I think those lines there are very interesting because you talk about, on one hand, machine learning, which is something that I worked in a little bit before I pursued publishing full time. But one thing that you mentioned is that this armament system kind of has its own adaptive AI that it can go out and learn from its enemy, but it learns on a very basic scale where can't actually mimic it can't mimic its enemy enough that it can get whatever intelligence it wants because there's still that kind of human barrier that Riker's immediately able to identify as the reason why this is clearly not Paul Rice and this is clearly not someone to be trusted, which I think says more
Yeah,
about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
there's an artificial intelligence component here, and you mentioned machine learning, and I put that in my notes because I'm not sure how artificial intelligence, machine learning relate, from a technical or an operational sense. But at one point, the system, whatever it's called, is referred to as it has a dynamic adaptive design. But you bring up a big point, is that it's trying to gather intelligence, and you just said something about the human factor, and it's not able to do that. What gets, into when this weapon system actually becomes a threat, not to the away team on the surface, which ends up being Yar, Riker, Picard, and Crusher, with the latter two having fallen into a pit and Dr. Crusher severely injured, but also the machine has some sort of planetary defense also, or offense, and attacks the Enterprise. And,
and
the
seems to be able
human
to scale
decisions.
itself in size. So,
Right.
Sorry, I didn't mean
And
interrupt. Yeah.
no, that's all right. But the human decision that Geordi makes really outsmarts the machine, and it's like that human factor, that human ability to not just have a dynamic adaptive design, but to really think outside the box, is what ultimately defeats the system when the Enterprise comes back.
Well, I think one of the things. Sorry,
and,
go ahead.
and the other thing along with that is, and this is kind of serendipitous, is Picard finding that the pit they've fallen into is actually the control center for the whole system.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Which is a serendipitous event that the machine couldn't prevent.
Right. Well, one thing that is interesting about this AI is that, it's been made clear, and it's kind of the entire argument that's, there's two storylines going here: the weapons argument and then Geordi's storyline.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we're talking, the story about Menos is that they kept designing better and better weapons until one day they designed kind of an AI or a weapon that turned on them and wiped them out. It's kind of like the story of Terminator with Skynet, where
right,
which has really influenced a lot of general discussion about AI. And I kind of wanted to stop and talk about machine learning for a second, because it's really two different things. AI and machine learning are not. Sorry, go
I have
ahead.
a quick question before you go there.
Yeah.
Was Terminator, the movie, was it after 1988 or before? Do you know?
I think it was before 88. Yeah, Terminator 1's 1984. Terminator 2's 1991.
Okay.
Terminator 2 is
that
actually
my
where
question.
So, and the first Terminator really is like a seminal film in terms of our discussion of artificial intelligence in general.
Right.
A lot of the negative context of a military AI taking over and subjugating humans literally starts seriously with that film. I think it's the first film to put it in visual context.
That was my question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, like, it's a film that puts it in real visual context.
Right.
And, in the most apocalyptic way possible, which, to tell you the truth, if a military AI were to turn on humans, it wouldn't send robotic assassins or take over tanks. It would probably do much more subtle things that we wouldn't realize that would control us, like taking down cell phone networks, turning off our internet, turning off our power, destroying our food distribution networks. Like, you don't need to actually fire a bullet to beat us.
It would just hack all of our systems.
Well, it could starve us out. It could starve us, blind us,
right.
choke us out, basically.
Right. Well, go on with your discussion of machine learning versus AI.
So, AI, or artificial general intelligence, is the idea that you can create a system or a network that is able to think, interpret, create, and basically disseminate information and apply it in a way that is equal or better to a human. Now, machine learning is in itself a process. And I'm going to explain it a little bit poorly, because it is kind of a difficult thing. for me still to understand it, and it's probably the reason why wasn't very good in it. So, a couple episodes back, we had this discussion about binaries. We kind of live in this world of binary where there's masculine, feminine, yes, no, day or night, sky or earth, one or two. Um, the problem traditionally was with that binary thinking, you weren't able to keep all of the decisions that you were making in that binary all stored in the same space. Well, that changed when we were able to kind of scale how much storage we were able to keep on our computer chips or our microchips. The fact that we are able to keep terabytes now, or you know, much more than that on very small microchips is really kind of miraculous scientifically, because it allows us to do many more processes on a computer that we weren't able to beforehand. So, what machine learning does and why it's so revolutionary is that machine learning basically takes all of these binary decisions that have been made, and it not only stores them, but it's able to access them instantly. So when it is confronted by a new set of problems, if that new problem has any precedent to problems that the machine has faced before, it can instantly go back to that information that it gathered previously and that knowledge it gathered previously in terms of dealing with previous problems like the one it's presented with now. And it's able to basically learn on the fly how to deal with things. And because it's already learned how to deal with those previous problems, it's going to solve the problem in front of it instantly, and all along the way, maybe solve the next 10 problems behind it. Machine learning is basically, I talk about the psychedelic LSD sometimes. Machine learning is basically LSD for a computer. Like it can just
Mm-hmm.
process information, interpret it, extrapolate it, and then use it and apply it in a way that it couldn't beforehand because it has so much more access to information. Um, versus, and it plays a part in AI, but machine learning in itself is not an artificial general intelligence. It's just a process that goes into
Okay.
building an AI. So like that's the
Right.
real
Right.
differential.
Okay. Good.
Um
Thank you.
so hopefully not butchering that too badly. The
No,
interesting
I think
thing
that
that
was good.
I think the interesting thing about this episode is that in some ways, they have the writers of Star Trek already have this concept of AI and a military artificial intelligence. And they already have this concept that, like, if you're not in control of this thing, things can go poorly. One aspect of this episode debuting in 1988, and you mentioned it beforehand, is that the Cold War is still going on. And at the center of the Cold War is this race for nuclear weapons. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak for a moment. What is the atmosphere like in 1988 with the Cold War going on? What was the arms race really like to live through at the time?
Well, it was it really, I guess you could say really it was living in the atomic age. And when you were in grade school in the mid 50s into the 60s, elementary schools and all schools would have drills where in case there was a nuclear attack, you go out in the hall and you know kneel down the floor next to your lockers, and that's how you were going to survive a 1 megaton or a 2 megaton blast that was going to take out Manhattan or New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago, which was just crazy. And I remember one of the times that I was most fearful as a child. I was 10 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it was the night in October 62 where Kennedy had put up the naval blockade, and it was, the night where the Cuban freighters carrying additional missiles were going to come up to the blockade line, and were they going to stop, or was there going to be conflict or whatever? And I remember being cognizant enough of what was going on and knowing what an atomic bomb or nuclear weapons were, that going to bed that night feeling that I'm going to not wake up in the morning. And I went to sleep somehow, and I woke up in the morning, and then things started to draw down. It started to, people, we and the Russians started to back off from things. And, there were other events that weren't as public as that, where there was almost a nuclear engagement and so forth. But I think people just learned to live with it.
Mm-hmm.
And, people started to understand the idea, well, we've got, thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at Russia, and the Russians have thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at us.
Right.
And everyone knew that if there was a nuclear war, we would be obliterated. And very few people would survive, or the world as we know it wouldn't survive. So that's where the idea of, well, there's mutual assured destruction. One of the lines that the salesman on Mino says is that he mentions peace through superior firepower, and also to be totally armed is to be totally secure,
mm-hmm.
which are just two lines that were basically a different way of stating that put yourself in a mutually assured destruction. And, there was nuclear brinksmanship, particularly during the Reagan administration, where we deployed intermediate range ballistic missiles, particularly the Pershing systems in
mm-hmm.
Germany, which were mobile missiles that the U.S. Army would drive around southern Germany. And
really, just drive them around?
Oh, yeah. No, there's somebody who I won't mention his name, but he lives in Winston-Salem, was in the Army, and he was actually in the Army and was on a guard unit that would guard these things and drive them around. And those missiles, I think there was only one warhead on the Persian missiles, but they had dial-a-yield, where depending on how much lithium or something like that you put into the nuclear explosion, you could create like a 10 kiloton explosion if you just wanted to take out a division of Soviet tanks coming through the Fulda Gap. But if you wanted to completely wipe out a city in Poland that had a large concentration of Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops, you could dial it up to, 500 kilotons, a half a megaton, and take out basically a city. And that was nuclear brinksmanship, and the Russians did the same thing. And that is what led to a little bit like the first START treaties, where we started backing down off one another and, trying to reduce, like, this is ridiculous. We don't need to do this anymore.
I was about
and
to
there's
say.
nuclear brinksmanship, but there's nuclear brinksmanship that's get played now. Putin's doing that with, he just announced that, there's hypersonic missiles, and we're trying to develop hypersonic missiles that would be very difficult to defend against, even if you had a anti-ballistic missile system. Something really madness is that supposedly the Russians are developing a nuclear torpedo that could explode against near a coast and cause a radioactive tsunami wave that would just poison a coast. And it's like, why would anybody want to do that? Because if the Russians did that, they're going to get the nuke. Once you cross the line and use nuclear weapons, then you're going to get nuked back. So, it gets into the whole, one of the themes here is that, this adaptive, dynamic adaptive design of the weapons weapons manufacturers continue to do that, and so on, which, gets into a question down the line of how do we stop this and so on. But to kind of answer your question, I think in the 80s, we got become used to living under the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Isn't that crazy?
And it yes, and I think there's been some studies in terms of psychologically what did it do to people then.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't
Well,
know, but it's
I
it's totally absurd.
I have to imagine being 10 years old, going to bed thinking you're not going to wake up, and that just has to be a moment in your life that you don't let go of a little bit.
I didn't know the word fuck then, but basically, I just when I heard Kennedy speak, basically my mind went, "Oh fuck," or like, "God damn it, we're fucked."
Yeah. um, I think the idea of just driving a nuclear weapon that you could just dial up or down in terms of its yield, I'm just the idea of it is just so kind of crazy to me. But then, you stop and think about all the nuclear submarines that we had going through the Atlantic and Pacific
Oh
that are
yes.
probably
Oh
sitting
yeah.
on like huge armaments
Oh yeah.
and they probably have nuclear subs too that have huge
Oh
armaments.
yes.
And
Yeah.
it's just, you stop and think about it for a second, and it kind of gets to this thing that I've always admired in my favorite sort of sci-fi stories. And I Arsenal of Freedom's not my favorite episode, but it touches on a lot of themes that I think are that sci-fi does really well in terms of discussing technology and its availability to all parties, and that maybe something shouldn't be available. And I think one of those things that definitely shouldn't be available to everyone, and maybe not to anybody. Um, I think Star Trek here and shows like Farscape make a really good argument that just because that person has a weapon and that person has a weapon doesn't mean you have to have a weapon. And if anything, them
Well,
having a weapon and them having a weapon isn't a good decision either. And the
well,
continued
and
development of
this is
weapons is just
it,
going to
it,
eventually lead to the use of them.
well, potentially, and this is where I think that I made a note that America has an attitude toward the benefits of peace through strength and this sort of thing, which is there's some truth to that, but it's also very indicative of how strong the military-industrial complex still
Mm-hmm.
is. And the other comment I make about this episode entitled "The Arsenal of Freedom," once you get locked in to this continual need to have weapons and upgrade weapons, but truly ones of
Mm-hmm.
mass destruction, that there's no freedom in this. You're trapping yourself.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, Dad, I think I've been struggling with this philosophically, and people are going to hear this and they're going to think that I'm just so full of shit and being dramatic. But have I ever been any freer than other people in other first world like democracies? And I can probably answer, definitively at this point, no. There's probably people that I've known that have lived in freer places than I have at this point. And it's
I would
not
agree.
just living under a military industrial complex that siphons away so much public money that could be put to better
Oh, yes.
use. It's us having this kind of we've been living under a police state for most of this country's history. We're now really discovering, especially our black and brown brothers and sisters here in this country. They've been living through it basically the entire existence of this country. Um, from our taxation to the way we empower the rich over the poor, it's very hard to argue that America is actually the freest country in the world, or actually has ever been the freest country in the world, where there are places that have better social safety programs and better economic systems that maybe they don't produce the wealth or the flash or the opulence that America celebrates. And I think we are an opulent nation that celebrates our materialism far too much. But
Hmm.
they have a sense of safety and concern for their people that I think that we're really devoid of in this moment and era. And I think that's why, Ben, you're listening to this. It's April 2021. The country's starting to reopen after the coronavirus pandemic. And one thing that's kind of being lost in history, and I think it's by the time you listen to this, Ben, if you listen to it, I hope things are different, but they won't be talking about the amount of shootings that were taking place around the time that you were born. Um,
Hmm.
Ben, in some ways you were lucky because on one hand, you were born at the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. So a lot of people were forced to quarantine. So a lot of these mass shootings, lowered or came to an end. But now that we're reopening here in April of 2021, there's suddenly a big surge of gun violence again. It says something about a country where the ability for someone to kill and access tools that can help them kill indiscriminately is held higher than the safety and dignity of innocent people on the street. But I think that's kind of an example of how we're living with this illusion of freedom here in America when if we really want to talk about it in real human terms that respect the dignity of living sentient people, which is another theme in Star Trek that matters, we at this moment in April of 2021 as a country are severely deficient.
Well, you make a good point because I think that other countries, you'd have to chart it out somehow in a matrix system. There are countries that are just as free as we are, if not freer,
Oh, and they
partially
still have
because,
problems. They still have problems
oh yeah,
too.
I was going to say there's
Yeah.
not perfect. They have problems. They have major problems, different from ours. For instance, they don't have the gun violence issue because they don't have the culture of guns. Yeah, they do have racism issues, but in some ways they have a better, for a large percentage of the portion of their populations, they have, I think, a better quality of life. And it makes me think of, I remember the first time I saw it, I didn't watch the series that Jeff Daniels was in when he was the newspaper reporter, but well, you know, remember gave the
Newsroom?
speech, he was at a
Oh, Newsroom. Yeah.
newsroom,
Yeah.
the first episode,
Aaron
and
Sorkin. Yeah. Good
you know,
show.
they asked the panel what's so good about America, and they say freedom, 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 and blah blah blah, and all this, and he says we're not the best country, and he goes down the list of the deficiencies that we have,
Hmm.
and that basically what he points out is all of the facts that he pointed out that he listed were basically ignored because of everybody's flag waving and we're the greatest, and we're the freest, we're the most powerful. And it's like, no, when you really think about it, we we aren't. Which gets into, I mean, this again, it goes back to the the title of the episode is the Arsenal of Freedom. And when you get trapped in this habit of having to spend so much money on defense
Hmm.
or offense, whatever, how do you break away from it? I saw something on YouTube today, and I don't know how valid it was, but it was somebody comparing in 2021, the military resources that NATO had versus Russia.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of categories, but one of the things is like the combined defense budget of all the NATO countries is like, I don't know, $2 trillion.
Yeah.
And Russia spends like 92 billion.
Yeah.
So it's like if you could, again, it's just like what happened in Gulf War One, if you can put a coalition together, that was the term I was looking to before, and put it under a single command and control structure so you can, direct all of this military power against an enemy like we did in Iraq and fight smarter and so forth. It's like with the brinksmanship that Putin is doing by putting a lot of conventional forces on the Ukrainian border right now, if there was the political will to, just take
Oh yeah.
Russia out, as long as we didn't get ourselves in a position that we went nuclear on each other, it's not even a contest in some ways.
Well,
The question is the political will there to do it?
I think the deadliest thing about the military industrial complex is that it proves that you can make money off of war without having to kill anyone. And I
You
think
can make money off the idea of fighting a war without fighting a war.
yes.
If you go to Northern Virginia
And
and
even
look
when I
at
say without killing anyone, like people are still dying from this. But like
yeah,
in terms of like having the truth is these massive arms companies really don't want to have a massive war. They don't. Because
no,
that
no.
depletes them of customers. Like
It's just like it's just like this planet. Yeah.
well, one interesting thing I wanted to say about Minos and the Minosians, I think one of the reasons why their weapon ultimately turns and destroys them is that they don't have any competition on their planet.
Right.
Like they don't have a mutually assured destruction or a mad principle like we had with the Russians because they don't have any competition.
They there was some control, mutual assured destruction provided some modicum of control. They didn't have any.
yeah, and I think that's ultimately why they are destroyed by this. I think what
Right.
happens with us is that the Minosians are victims of trying to make more money and having the thing that's making their money turn on them and destroy them. The thing that we're the victim of is that we're we're not even necessarily making money. Like if we talk about the military industrial complex and we're honest about it, you brought up that Russia spends 92 billion, NATO spends 2 trillion. How much of that is just in bureaucratic waste? How much of that is in payoffs? How much of that is just, in basically illicit funds that get washed into different parts of the global conflicts?
Well, I'm just thinking historically, also particularly World War One. One of the factors that drove um, socialist or Bolshevik various
Mm-hmm.
types of revolutions in Europe was the realization it was the capitalist arms manufacturers in
Exactly.
Britain, Germany, Russia, Austria, and the United States that were making a shit pot full of money after providing the arms so that all these patriotic young men could go off into the fields of Flanders and so forth and die.
Well, one thing that so people at home, Dad and I were talking about kind of the generational trauma, which is a very loaded term, I think, but the generational trauma that his generation, the baby boomers, faced with Vietnam, and how that my generation, millennials, will face a similar trauma with Afghanistan and Iraq. One thing that I don't think that we ever respected about um, the First World War, I think, is very unique because here in America, we kind of glorified the Civil War as this really bloody conflict. And it was. It was a terrible conflict that claimed, you know, hundreds of thousands of people.
I think the count is about 700,000 now.
Yeah. Um, but the amount of dead in World War One and the lethality of the weapons that were used. Literally, World War One is a jump from cavalry to cannons, and not just cavalry. They used cannons in the Civil War and wars leading up to World War One, but the cannons that the leap in artillery technology that took place in World War One versus what was being used beforehand was such a huge jump. And the chemical weapons that were used in trench
The
warfare in World War One were such a huge jump versus things that were used beforehand. So
there were
the
two
lethality and the amount of people that were dying is so traumatic versus what anyone had seen beforehand.
there were some transitions in warfare that took place during the American Civil War. It was one,
Hmm.
ironclad ships. Secondly, if you look at what happened around Petersburg, Virginia, and Richmond in the end of 1864 and 1865, it was trench warfare that they had.
Hmm.
The other thing, you're very correct about artillery, and I think that there was such an industrialization process of steelmaking and gun, artillery technology. It really showed up during the Franco-Prussian War. That's when the big guns rolled out. And then it just, once they realized, particularly the Germans with Krupp and so forth, that they could make these massive cannons and so forth, and the lethality, then it just,
Well, the,
led to the heavy use of artillery during World War One.
well, the reason I bring up lethality is because it has it kind of has a double-edged effect. Because on one hand, you create these weapons that, and this gets back into the mad principle, and it gets back into nuclear weapons are the ultimate end of what I'm talking about here. But you create a weapon that is so devastating on a level of lethality and violence that everyone wants to have one because they think the only way they can protect themselves is if they're all carrying a shotgun. It's the old joke. You brought a you brought a knife to a gunfight.
Yes,
Everyone wants to
exactly.
have. No one wants to have a knife at the gunfight anymore. Everyone wants to have a gun. So, but once
Right.
everyone has a gun, someone's going to bring a shotgun. Well, then everyone wants to
No,
have a shotgun,
now
and it
everyone
just
has to have an AR-15.
yes, and then it's soon going to become well. It's not just having an AR-15. Everyone needs to have like an infiltrator drone. It just builds up to that, and what it's basically getting to is that the military industrial complex has convinced us that we need to keep buying these weapons that we shouldn't ever use, and we know we shouldn't use them, but if we don't buy them, we're gonna have them used on they're gonna be used on us. It's in some ways the greatest psychological trick that we get, that we are dealing with. And to get to your question, how do we break it? Honestly, the only way we break this, and it's what they identify in the episode here, the only way you break this is by putting these weapons down. Like, you just put the weapons down. At some point we're all going to have to be very discriminate, and we're going to have to humble ourselves, and we're going to have to all agree that instead of worrying about whether or not we can blow each other off the face of the earth, we just need to put these weapons down and decide that we're going to work out a solution that doesn't involve them. Because otherwise, if we keep adding this option of, we need to have these weapons and we need to be ready, and we're always going to be in this mode of, okay, if we're always going to be ready, but we always need to make sure that our weapons are up to par, and they're not only up to par, they're better than our enemy's weapons. And this cycle of
Uh,
continuously creating a military industrial complex will continue. This doesn't end
and
unless we get rid of weapons.
this feeds back, I think, to some degree into the rise of colonialism in the last several hundred years,
Yes.
um, and countries having to be some countries rising to the level that they become imperial powers. Britain, Germany,
So
France, Russia.
so
I think the United States, when there's one of the things that Vietnam in the Cold War, there was a lot of, some of the propaganda that the Russians and the Chinese would put out is that America was about imperialism and about capitalist imperialism. And
Mhm.
those charges, so to speak, against us weren't without merit in a sense. Because thinking through this, I think that getting into how do you break this cycle, U.S. is an imperial power. Yeah, you could say, well, we're a force for good, like the Navy adds, and we're the
Mhm.
world's policemen. And one of the comments that was made this week is that maybe Biden's saying, guess what? Fuck Afghanistan. We're not going to be the world's policeman anymore. We can't afford to do it because
Right.
we have so many problems we have to deal with here. So,
Right.
is this the start of a change in mindset around the world where, and this gets into the rise of China. China wants to become an imperial power again, but is that really the best thing for them to do?
Well,
It gets into a book that we were talking about before we started. Is that some strong leaders feel that they have to um, project their leadership through their country being very aggressive and growth oriented and expansionistic. And so you see that in Xi Jinping, you see that in Putin right now. Are we starting to back away from that now? I don't know. If the United States starts to back away, then does that allow others that have these new imperial ambitions, to expand what they're doing because the United States is not there to check them? Or do they say, well, maybe we don't need to do this anymore as much? I don't, it's a real question.
Do you want to be deeply terrified?
Do I want to be deeply terrified?
Yeah, do you want me to deeply
Go ahead.
terrify you right now? Okay.
Yeah, because you're
Um,
going to answer my question.
so my answer is that I think uh, your questions are appropriate, they're poignant, they're important. They're also wrong. They're also the wrong questions. Um,
Okay.
I I don't think it's a matter of us necessarily pulling back. I think us pulling out of Afghanistan is a realization of one of two things. It is pulling us out because we have failed another land war, but that's because land wars are basically obsolete. I don't think that we're actually going to have another land war where we move massive amounts of forces across a large tract. We might drop a large amount of forces by air or maybe raid by sea a city one day, maybe. But the changing aspect of war is going off the physical battlefield of blood and bullets, and it's becoming bytes and viruses, and it's becoming teams of hackers, and it's becoming predator drones still, even though those might get phased out because dropping bombs on people still creates collateral damage you can't afford. This gets back to what I was talking about earlier. Like, if you develop a military AI, why bomb or shoot someone when you can starve them out, turn off their power, turn off their internet, turn off their water supply systems? You know, war in itself is just changing. I think
Well, but then
Biden is
I would
recognizing
argue,
that, and even
yeah,
Putin putting like troops on the Ukrainian border, as you mentioned earlier, like that's just a show of force. He can't actually cross the
yes,
Ukrainian border. Like,
right,
what we're
right, yeah,
realizing the world over is that we can't
right.
afford to actually have these huge landed armies. They're just
He's
untenable
the
now.
one commentary today said he's doing that to just make the point you cannot ignore Russia.
Exactly.
You know,
Well,
it's
like,
it's it's again it's political brinksmanship. But what you say is, again, is if we develop cyber capability and the Russians uh, develop cyber capability, and then throw in North Korea, so we start turning off each other's power systems and so forth. Is that if there was the ability for different countries to do that to each other, does that create another mutually assured destruction scenario? Because that's we talked at one point about the possibility of some sort of gamma radiation blast or solar flare that would have such strong electromagnetic pulse that it would knock out all of our electronics. And in a matter of minutes, we'd be back in the 12th century on this planet, everybody.
I think the so let me answer it this way. I'm at one point I fancied myself a swordsman because I studied all these different fencing techniques and I trained with different fencers, and I actually had a fencing master, Christopher Scott Thompson, who ran the Cateran Society. One thing that I learned from all this was that swords were a completely inopportune and imperfect weapon, and they deserved to be on walls and in displays and in collections more than they just deserve to be in use, because hacking into someone's hard, dangerous, terrifying, terrible work. Um, but if you're going to put down the sword, you have to graduate to a gun. Well, at some point, everyone has a gun, and the truth is, firing at each other is just as deadly and is just as stupid as swinging swords at each other. So at some point, the sword becomes a tool or a toy or a collectible, and so does the gun. And I think that's one of the things that we're dealing with here in the country now, that we're having in some ways we're having a debate over collectibles that can kill people. But anyway, once everyone puts down the guns, everyone's going to start picking up laptops and learning how to hack. And I think you just start getting this escalation over time where you might have you might have a mad principle take hold, but this is the terrifying part. This is the part where I was going to terrify you. I think not only the nature of warfare is changing, but with the nature of warfare, I actually think that you may see a change in the nature of governance. And not only the nature of governance, but how people organize themselves on a national or international front. And it may be without borders or without, the idea of being part of a sovereign nation. One thing that I have been talking to a lot of economists, especially people who work in the crypto space, one thing that people need to watch out for in the future is the formation of digital confederacies. Um, you don't necessarily need to have a government anymore, or theoretically, you don't need to have a government to take on another sovereign power and cripple them militarily or economically. Arguably, you can do that with a cyber attack. And if you have enough people who are able to coordinate, and you now have the systems that, let's say Putin and Jinping were like, fuck me being the president of Russia. And he's like, well, fuck me being the head of the Communist Party here in China. We're both trillionaires. Let's just be warlords. They could get together and set up a digital confederacy where they could put together they'd still have their own little private land army. But let's say they went out and bought the best hackers and the best digital spies and the best corporate espionage specialists out there. And let's just say they put together like this little shadow empire behind the scenes. And they decide one day, well, we've coordinated this team of people that we have serving us, and we're just going to turn off all the systems around the world, and we're going to hold the world hostage, and it's just going to be us. Now, what I told you sounds a lot like comic book supervillainy, but
Sounds a little bit like the perfect Dr. Evil.
but it almost sounds laughable. But with the oncoming of AI and the oncoming of crypto and the oncoming of blockchain and Ethereum, and people being able to privatize their technology as it gets smaller and becomes more mobile, the idea of a digital confederacy, a small group of people or a small group of organizations coming together and possibly affecting their will on the greater populace outside of the idea of countries or territories is a real possibility.
Well, what's really
Okay,
scary is
look,
that this is
James
an
Bond
opportunity for
Spectre. What I'm talking about is Spectre, essentially. Spectre in
well,
the James
yeah,
Bond
but
universe is a
yeah,
digital confederacy.
yeah.
They're
And
their
the
own
other thing is,
nation to themselves.
yes, you're right, and it also is very scary in terms of just an organized domestic group doing domestic terrorism.
Oh, absolutely. One thing that we should be really lucky is that the people who follow QAnon and the people that are part of the Oath Keepers and everyone that took part in the January 6th, 2021 attempted coup in DC, we should just be happy that they're not all computer engineers and hackers and because if someone really wanted to do damage to the country or do damage to any country, we've become so dependent on cloud computing, and we're soon going to become very dependent
Mhm.
on machine learning and quantum computing and AI. You know, I think one aspect of the future of warfare is developing AIs that break other AIs. So, like,
Mm.
if you had a planet like Minos, their entire military industrial complex, like, they wouldn't actually sell you the Echo Papa 607 unit. They'd sell you a program that would break the AI of the Echo Papa 607 unit.
Well,
Like, I
what?
think
Yeah,
that's the
and what
future,
you're
designing specified AIs that break other AIs.
well, what you say fits in with a general principle that goes back to an episode of the original series where Spock supposedly defects to the Romulans, and Kirk, disguises himself as a Romulan and so forth because they want to steal the cloaking device.
Right.
And they end up capturing a Romulan commander, female Romulan commander that Spock has to seduce as part of his shtick with the Romulans. And at the end, he says, well, something to the effect that military secrets are the most elusive of all. That, yeah, we'll develop a cloaking device from our stealing the Romulan cloaking device, but then the Romulans will develop something to counter that. And that gets into this whole thing about this machine on Minos having dynamic adaptive design. It gets into, I think, is that until society, countries, leaders define can understand that there's better ways, there's better things to spend our resources on, this is going to keep on going.
Yeah. Well, like, so I've mentioned this show a lot, but The Expanse,
Right.
and during The Expanse, like the big interstellar conflict or the big intersystem conflict is between Earth and Mars, and
Right.
Mars has developed better technology, especially better military technology, but Earth has built up their military to the point where they just dwarf Mars. So if they get into a conflict, the only reason they win is that they have like 20 ships to one against Mars. They may not
Right.
have better technology, they could just batter them to death. Um the problem is, like, when they finally do come into conflict, everything has to be so precise in terms of how they deal with everything that one mistake off literally costs the lives of 2 million people in one episode. And it's, I think one thing that has to be hammered home in all this is that when we talk about why we put these weapons down, it's not just because, people are making money. It's not just because it creates more danger in the world. It's not because it creates more conflict. At the end of the day, people are suffering because of our inclination and predilection to constantly develop greater tools of death and conflict. The one reason why we should just stop all this is because, you know, we're recording this right now for someone who's 1 year and 3 months old. I live every day knowing that someone his age dies every day from war and conflict, or starvation or sickness. But
There's
someone
starvation,
died.
disease.
But
Right.
but war and conflict takes a child every day, someplace, somewhere, and that to me is the most damnable thing about our species. If an alien came down and said, "What is the thing that you can say about Earth?" I would be able to look at those aliens and say, "Our children die here needlessly." Um,
Well, it gets back to one of the thoughts I had from this episode was, what I consider, we've discussed this, it was sort of a ridiculous statement that the one American historian made when the Berlin Wall fell and the communism was ending, the Soviet Union fell, that was the end of history. And that was just, no, it was not the end of history. And there'll never really be an end to history. But when we get to the point that we can break out of this behavior that's goes back to, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens competing with each other, and humans trying to fight off saber-toothed tigers, and people competing for agricultural lands and resources and gold, and a lot of the things that Star Trek represent, which is very idealistic. That's when history won't end, but it will have a major shift in the way we behave.
well, one thing that I think Star Trek also helps us realize is that, you were talking about all the conflicts between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but that's only one. That conflict is also only one part of the story. There's also tremendous amount of evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens intermarried. That
Yes, that's true.
we
That's
also
right.
lived in, you know, we developed ways to live in balance with the saber-toothed tiger because we didn't wipe them out. Um, I think there's a story about humanity of us being able to not only be good shepherds of the earth, but be good shepherds of ourselves and each other. And I think that's another part of the story that I think,
Well,
getting back to these things that we talk about, arsenals of freedom, and these slogans that we throw to each other, it's very hard to throw human slogans at these ideas of compassion and brotherhood. But they're so much more meaningful than those slogans.
last night I found on Netflix, I think it was on Netflix, I think it was a program that Leonard Nimoy's son did. I think he called it The Search for Spock. And it was basically a biography that he put together of Leonard Nimoy, and
Oh
particularly
yeah.
how he became the character of Spock, and back in the 60s and 70s, when the 3 years that the original series ran, and how popular Spock became, and that even after the series was canceled and it went into to syndication, and it ran everywhere into the 70s,
Hmm.
into the 80s, until Next Generation came up, that Spock represented science and logic and trying to do things differently, which gets
Yeah.
into again what Star Trek represents. And it even talked about it in this picture. It was a different future. It's what's Roddenberry thought about, that things can be different. Here's how it
Yeah.
might look, and it wasn't
Well,
perfect, and there was still conflict, but humans could do better than we were doing then, and then we can do better than we're doing now.
and getting back to like what the where the series begins with Q's indictment of humanity, the reason
Exactly.
why
Right.
the reason why we can do better is because we've always had it in ourselves to do better. Being able to
Right.
do better is an intrinsic human quality, which I
Right.
don't, but it's an intrinsic human quality that you can take to its positives or to its negatives. Um, transitioning real quick, the other half of this episode is the story about Geordie LaForge being left in command of the
Right.
Enterprise and having
Yes.
to really learn to manage to deal with the crisis as the ship faces off against one of the Echo Papa 607 models. Um, I think this is a great episode for LeVar Burton, who I think is always a great actor. But I think it really shows. I think that this episode's very good in showing how Geordi is able to mature and progress as a character. And in many ways, I came away from this episode like, well, everyone technically could be a captain on that bridge. Like, Geordi was the captain of this episode because, Riker and Picard are both down on the planet. Geordi, by all means, did as well as Picard could do in the situation. I think it actually says something very good about Starfleet, and not just Geordi, but Starfleet in general, where they really do try to prepare everyone on that bridge to sit in that chair at a moment's notice and take over. And we've talked about the kind of away team structure before, how Riker doesn't want Picard to go down. That's kind of not what the captain does. The captain really does have to stay on the ship. At this point in the show, we've broken that so many times that Picard goes down, and and Riker's like, yeah, whatever, you can go. Here, let's bring Worf and Data and Yard Crusher too, and why not Wesley? Because it might be dangerous down there. Why not Wesley? But they will leave someone like Geordi or Worf, or usually Data. If Riker and Picard are down on the surface, it's usually Data who's third in command. But they're willing to leave Geordi, who, at this point isn't even a lieutenant commander, I don't think.
No.
I think it just says something interesting about the belief that Starfleet has in the people that they train. But also, it's interesting when he has to deal with Chief Engineer Logan, that there is still kind of like this conflict of rank between the bridge and superiors outside of it, especially in terms of senior personnel in the crew, like a chief engineer that we see in Logan. I was just curious about what you thought, just about Geordi's captaining of the ship, but also like kind of the conflict of rank that takes place, but also, the kind of confidence that's placed in him despite what would be seen as his relative immaturity for the role.
Oh, I think it was just really interesting because Logan, goes on the basis that, look, the Riker and Picard are stuck down on the planet. We're both lieutenants, but I have seniority, so I should be in charge. And I think Geordi very correctly states that, no, I'm not turning over command to you because it was Captain Picard that put me in charge. He did not put you. I need you to go back and be the engineer. And, he stands his ground. And that's important to the story because once they realize they have to leave the planet and come up with a different strategy so that Enterprise is not destroyed by the weapon that the machine on the planet has put into orbit with the Enterprise, Geordi very smartly comes with the outside of the box solution where, well, we're not going to leave them there. I'm going to separate the saucer and go man the battle bridge and take the star drive unit with the weapons, back and recover Picard and the rest of the crew members there. And so he really shows good command presence, and Troy kind of acts as a mirror to him as to help him understand how he has to project himself. It's interesting how he stands very close to
that's right,
the people that are at the helm and so forth. At one point, I thought this was a little funny in a way that he put his hand on the female, pilot's shoulder or something like that, where he did not do that to the male. And but he projected.
That character has
he
been
projected
shown before, yeah.
Yeah, she's been there before, and but he projected confidence in himself. That confidence flowed down to the people he was commanding, that you're well trained, you can do your jobs, we're going to get through this. And then, the icing on the cake is after the away team is recovered and Geordi wants to return command of the Enterprise to Picard, Picard just shows his confidence in Geordi by saying, I want the ship back the way I left it to you. So you stay in command and let's rendezvous with the saucer section. Then you can give me my ship back.
So I think somewhere early in our recording of this first season, I said something that they haven't separated the saucer section a lot. They've actually separated the saucer section a good bit this season. This has to be at least the third or fourth time they've done this now.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting in general as a tactic. I think it makes me wonder for a second. I know this is kind of out of the left field, but what the actual distribution of the ship is in terms of the crew, because if you wanted to get all the people to safety, it's very clear that you put them on the saucer section. You let the saucer section escape because the battle bridge has the main warp drive still.
Right.
But one thing that I think that you hit on is, Geordi is very good in terms of being able to build up the confidence of the crew around him. But you highlighted Troy very well in terms of she serves a very important role in the ship, not just in terms of how she serves Captain Picard, but she's really there to reinforce anyone that's sitting in that chair.
Yes.
Or she has a very distinct ability to, and maybe it's because of her, partial telepathy due to being a betazoid. She's
right. The empathic abilities that she has. Yeah.
Right. She's very good about being able to drill down to what the person's hang up is in the moment.
Right.
And present them with a solution that they can figure out for themselves. And I think that this is a very good episode for both of them that highlights kind of not just the strength of the two characters, but this, we're talking in some ways the strength of the structure of the bridge itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because, you're right in terms of Geordi is very, very, very firm in the fact that Picard really did give him command, and that Logan can't just come on the bridge and take command because he wants it. It's very interesting in terms of and I know that you were in the Navy. Is there really a difference of, I guess, structure and culture versus in terms of what happens on the bridge versus what happens on the rest of the ship?
Because I think you really have to have, whatever section you're in, you have to have people really working together as a team. But when you're on the bridge and, right next to that nearby is going to be your combat information center, you've got to have good communication between everyone. Everybody very concise in their communication and repeating orders and understanding chain of command and so on. Yes.
How many people do you think outside of the combat communication center actually has the power to walk onto the bridge of let's say a aircraft carrier and say, "Hey, I was working down in the engineering section, but I outrank you. I'm in charge now." Because that seems a little implausible.
Yeah, that's very implausible. That wouldn't happen. No.
Okay, because there was part of me when I was watching this and Chief Engineer Logan walks on, I'm like, why are you even up here?
Yeah, exactly.
You're up here to complain about you not being given the post you think you deserve, but you left your post.
The other comment I just thought of in terms of the separation of the saucer section, it gets into, we've talked about how they have a little story or event in one episode that then gets built on in a future episode. And I can't remember this. I don't know if this is the second, third time that they separated, but remember we talked about in the first episode, well, why do they have to do that then? Well, maybe they had to do it then because they knew they were going to use that, in a future episode. So they just needed to demonstrate in Farpoint that, hey, guess what? The saucer section can separate from the star drive.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I'm trying to just remember if they so the big moment that I remember that the separation between the saucer section and the wharf in battle the battleship, I guess it's called the battle bridge,
Mhm.
takes part is best of both worlds when they're trying to stop the Borg and rescue Locutus to get Picard
Mhm.
back.
Right, right.
It seems like after that they never separate the ship ever again. So I think you're right. I think there's this kind of constant building reminder of like, hey, we can do this.
Mhm.
But it just seems to get dropped at one point, like in a later season. I don't know. Again, I thought that they didn't separate as much this first season. And I've been wrong, so I'll probably be wrong later on. Um, I do find the I do find the design of the ship more interesting now that we've been discussing it, just because again we've talked about kind of the very weird situation that the Enterprise D is in. On one hand, it's the flagship of this large military fleet for one of the biggest powers in the Alpha Quadrant, but on the other hand, like it's a small city carrying like a lot of civilians, over
Mhm.
700 civilians,
Mhm.
at the same time being a scientific and research vessel, a medical facility. Because a lot of these episodes have been the Enterprise being sent to other planets to handle huge medical disasters.
Right, right.
So in some ways, there is very much a flying hospital aspect to
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
Enterprise.
Yes.
I find it interesting that they have still created a ship that it it just seems to me, and maybe this is the part where like Star Trek has its problems. Um, okay, if you separate the saucer section and people know that all the civilians are on the saucer section, what stops them from ever just, oh, forget attacking the battle bridge? Of course, that's more powerful. Go kill the saucer section, and we'll figure out the battle bridge. It just seems to be like a giant design flaw.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it fits in with we don't know when they separate who goes where exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Um.
How many people do you really need on the star drive section to run it? It's just not the people on the battle bridge, I'm sure.
Very very
I would
true.
think.
Yeah. So okay, there was one last question in your notes that kind of getting back to our discussion about imperialism and like if the U.S. decided to draw back on military expenditures, would Russia and China try to expand their empires? Um, I think that kind of I think we can actually use the episode to attack that question a little bit. I think that at some point the story of Minos is if you put all your time and energy into building conflict, at some point you kind of have this negative return, whether it's the destruction of your own society or just the general decay of your society. I think that if we pulled back on our military expenditures now and we put that money towards things like infrastructure, education, one thing that we haven't talked about in terms of this Biden infrastructure package that really kind of bothers me is that we haven't talked about making cuts to the military and to the military budget, which we definitely could do. And if you want to talk about paying for the infrastructure package, there's paying for a good chunk of it right there. Um, I think if we were to cut back our military expenditures, I don't think China or Russia would cut back theirs anymore. I think they're probably doing the maximum of what they can do, actually. I think the fact that we're spending so much is the real insanity of all this, but we've previously discussed that.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yes. Yeah. I think that we're more addicted. I think that we're more locked into. Uh, I think that we have really ignored Eisenhower's warning more than we ever know,
Oh
ever
yeah.
than we understand.
Well, just for context, because some people may not know what we're talking about. When Eisenhower left office, presidents give a final speech a lot. And during Eisenhower's speech, he gave this very poignant warning about the buildup of the American. Yeah, Dad's holding up a picture of Dwight D.
Like,
Eisenhower,
right. Yeah.
Ike. Um, he gave this warning that the buildup of the military industrial complex would lead to not only greater corruption, but greater conflict the world over. And that if we wanted to maintain our democratic ideals and social progress, that we really had to rein in kind of not only in military spending, but our just the power of our military production because it could quickly get out of hand. I think the story here of Minos is a prime example of that. But I also think that, one of the ways this episode is kind of dated in itself in 1988 is that I think China and Russia are just moving on, just like we are from this, and this is not going to be the method of war in the future. So, just to summarize everything up, how do you like this episode in terms of where it is in the season, and just sum up your general thoughts on it before we
I
close up
think it
for
was
the
a little bit, it was a little bit of a different topic. It was very timely relative to the times. So
Mhm.
I think it was good. I enjoyed
Yeah,
it. It was fun.
I just wanted to mention for a second the peddler, as he's deemed on Memory Alpha, was played by the
Right.
very good actor Vincent Schiavelli,
Yes.
who's been in a lot of great things. But
Yes.
I just wanted to mention that before we go. Vincent Schiavelli played the peddler. Great character, by the way. Like his
Yes.
dialogue and his delivery through the entire
It was
thing is
good. Yeah.
my
Yeah.
favorite part is when he realizes that like Picard isn't may not buy his product. His face just kind of drops.
Right.
It's just a very good character. And on that note, we will end the episode for tonight. Our next episode we will be discussing is Symbiosis, Star Trek Next Generation episode, season 1, I'm sorry, episode 22 or 21 on Netflix. We'll see you all then. Thank you, Jake, for joining me tonight, and everyone have a good time.
Thank you, Jay.